Hi, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. November 9th, 1989, the wall fell. No, not that wall. No, not that one either.
Six! My friend, you have revealed your deepest fear! I sentence you to be exposed before your peers! Tear down the wall!
We are talking about the Berlin Wall. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, friends, family members, loved ones who had been separated by that damn barrier for so long were permitted to pass freely. Berliners partied enthusiastically into the night. Some of them spontaneously began to demolish the wall with whatever tools were available and sometimes with their bare hands. Within a matter of months, the communist government of East Germany had fallen, and Germany itself had been reunified. Other communist regimes throughout Eastern and Central Europe fell like dominoes. By 1991, even the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. The Cold War, which had plagued the world for so many decades, was finally at an end. If any set of changes could lay claim to be an unambiguous win for the good guys, a triumph of human freedom and justice, and as a bonus without bloodshed, it would seem to be 1989. So we're here to ask the question, was the end of the Cold War all it was cracked up to be? Or was it just BS? Let's find out. Obviously, there was a bunch of positive stuff that happened in 1989 and its wake. The fact that you had all of these popular protests against governments that, whatever their virtues may have been, genuinely lacked a popular mandate and were to greater or lesser degrees oppressive. Not all of the countries behind the Iron Curtain worked in quite the same way. But, at best, they were numbing authoritarian mediocrities, thinking here of Hungary under János Kadar. At the worst end of the spectrum, they were horrifying Stalinist nightmares. Ceausescu's Romania is what comes to mind in this instance. If that's what you're dealing with, none of it is in total all that good. And clearly 1989 represented the people expressing loud and clear that they no longer supported those governments. Whether we are talking about the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland, which, boy, if you want evidence that your Marxist government is failing, the fact that you can no longer command the support of the workers' movement, that's kind of a sign that you have really lost the plot there. Or the Civic Forum in Czechoslovakia, the movement to rebury the great hero of the 1956 rebellion, Imre Nagy, in Hungary, or the protests against the wall and the government of Erich Honecker in East Germany. You've got any host of examples of the people rising up and saying, no, we don't want this anymore in 1989. And the governments basically saying, you know what, we don't believe that it is worth using force to try and maintain power in the face of all of this popular dissent. Probably what was best and most admirable about 1989 you can find in the example of a dude named Václav Havel, who was a Czech dissident, intellectual, a guy who led a lot of the protests in 1989 and became the first post-communist president of the state of Czechoslovakia. I think he perhaps said it best In an essay he wrote in 1978 called The Power of the Powerless. Got myself a copy right here of his essays. Havel provided perhaps the clearest expression of the notion that all of these communist governments behind the Iron Curtain actually ran on BS. Like, bullshit was what allowed them to persist. They were based on a foundation of lies and required, if not the consent, at least the mute acquiescence of the people in order to function. Let me read you a brief snippet. Individuals need not believe all these mystifications. That is, all of the ways in which communist governments falsified reality. But they must behave as though they did, or they must at least tolerate them in silence, or get along well with those who work with them. For this reason, however, they must live within a lie. They need not accept the lie. It is enough for them to have accepted their life with it and in it. For by this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. And so then, if he has diagnosed the fact that these governments persisted on a foundation of bullshit, all that was needed to truly oppose them is to point out that, hey, all of this is not true, as he put it. As long as living a lie is not confronted with living the truth, the perspective needed to expose its mendacity is lacking. Like, Havel is good stuff. I admire the hell out of that guy. Certainly he stands as an example of what was best about 1989 and the collapse of all of these communist governments. Before we get too excited, though, there are some other things that we need to talk about that make the balance sheet not quite so positive. The clearest example of stuff not going right after 1989, you can see in the case of the former Yugoslavia. Not technically a part of the Soviet sphere of influence during the Cold War, but certainly a communist system that was sort of swept up in the enthusiasm of 1989. And Yugoslavia had been a confederation of Balkan Slavic nationalities throughout the 20th century. It had often required that sort of strong authoritarian government to keep them all getting along, but they had for decades. With the collapse of the communist government, however, one by one, the constituent parts of Yugoslavia began to declare their independence. So Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia. And this set the stage for a series of horrifying, grim civil wars during the 1990s. In particular, Bosnia was kind of ground zero for all sorts of nasty stuff as Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims fought one another. It saw such nightmares as the besieging of the city of Sarajevo for more than 3 years. The genocide of Bosnian Muslims in the city of Srebrenica, where 7,000 of them were murdered in cold blood. Within a few years, some 200,000 people were killed in the Balkan civil wars, and some 6 million refugees were displaced from their homes. So clearly, stuff did not work out well for the former Yugoslavia. That was the worst case scenario, but there were plenty of other problems that followed in the wake of 1989 as well. All of the countries that had been part of the Iron Curtain system attempted to make a transition from state-managed socialism to free-ish market capitalism, and that's a very tricky transition. In the best of circumstances, it requires a lot of planning, perhaps a gradual transition, but a lot of these, with the encouragement of the Western powers, it must be noted, made use of a strategy that was often referred to as shock therapy, just transitioning all at once, which unsurprisingly didn't always work out all that well economically. And, without trying to defend the Soviet system of government, but if there was one thing it had going for it, It was dedicated to providing equal access to economic resources for all. It didn't always succeed at that, but it did a pretty good job of making sure that everybody had access to education, to healthcare, and to the basics of everyday life. It sucked at providing like consumer goods and luxuries. All of that fell out the window during the 1990s. And some of these places experienced some pretty dramatic economic downturns. Life expectancy in Russia, what had been the heart of the Soviet system, dropped pretty precipitously during the 1990s. Actual life expectancy and quality of life was worse after the fall of communism. Suicide rates throughout most of the former Iron Curtain countries during the 1990s again rose. That is not the sign of a successful transition to a new system. And some of those economic effects continue to linger for quite some time. To this day, well into the 21st century, the portions of Germany that had been part of the communist East continue to have higher unemployment than the former West Germany, continue to have lower wages, continue to have a lower standard of living. And conversely, you saw the rise throughout much of the former Soviet system of tremendous income inequality. Super, super rich people, the quote-unquote oligarchs of Russia. In some ways, it seemed like the former Iron Curtain states managed to adopt all of the worst features of capitalism. Also, after the initial flush of the emergence of a genuine civil society, free speech, free press, multi-party free elections, in a lot of the countries that had been part of the Soviet system, you began to see as time went on a regrettable tendency to backslide into authoritarianism. Probably the first place you see this is in Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko, Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, more recently, Andrzej Duda and the Justice and Law Party in Poland, Viktor Orban and Fidesz in Hungary, and of course, Vladimir Putin in Russia, who cut his teeth as a young man working for the KGB in the 1980s, but adopted a right-wing ideology after becoming president of Russia, and whose favorite philosopher is the early 20th century Russian fascist, Ivan Ilyin. So, all of these movements, you have seen restrictions on the press, curbing judicial independence, violent reprisals against any opposition to the government, and in most cases, perhaps they are not as bad as the Iron Curtain sort of communist system at its worst. But certainly none of these movements represent the sort of dramatic improvement we would have hoped for when the wall came down. Now, rather than left-wing authoritarianism, unfortunately, in a lot of these places, you have a populist, nationalist, anti-immigrant authoritarianism. Is that really a positive step forward? But of course you might say, well, that's just those guys. They lost the Cold War. Sucks to be them. The guys who won, everything's going great. If we consider the winning side in the Cold War, the capitalist West, there, I think you can make an argument that things have not been all that rosy after the quote-unquote victory either. If nothing else, winning an ideological conflict can easily make one complacent about one system. Like, well, everything's going great, right? We won. We don't need to look at our own system critically and think about what needs to be improved. Economically, the turn towards neoliberalism had obviously begun well before the end of the Cold War in 1989. Leaders such as Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, argued that corporate taxes should be lowered, that government spending should be dramatically pared back, that regulation should be reduced or eliminated altogether. And that sort of trend led to a certain sort of economic growth, obviously. Corporate profits were way up in the 80s and 90s, but at the expense of very sort of stagnant wage growth for your average member of society, for members of the working class and the lower middle class. And this was something that continued even after the political right left office. Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party during the 1990s, Tony Blair and New Labour in the UK, those guys were supposed to be on the left, and they by and large picked up large elements of this kind of neoliberal program. And this led to a dramatic sort of skewing of wealth in Western societies. I think that plenty of people have argued the ultimate outcome of this was the so-called Great Recession of 2008, when risky speculation on the part of out-of-control financial corporations led to a near total collapse of the economy. When all was said and done, $16.5 trillion had evaporated. Unemployment soared to over 10%, higher for some segments of the population, particularly people of color. Hard to argue that the winners in the Cold War benefited all that much from their victory. The wealthy did. The rest of the society often suffered under very unequal distribution of wealth, poor provision for the basics of economic subsistence. Recommended reading. First off, I mentioned Havel and his essay, The Power of the Powerless, one of the absolute classics of the past generation of political thought. Highly recommend it. If you're looking for a brief, highly readable account of the events of 1989, the British journalist Timothy Garton Ash's The Magic Lantern gives you a rundown of that critical few months in 1989 in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. For a deeper dive, you could check out Charles Meyer's Dissolution, The Crisis of Communism and the End of East Germany from 1997, a very detailed sort of breakdown of what led to the collapse of the East German government and the end of the Berlin Wall that we started with. And for a history of the region since 1989, you could take a look at Philip Thayer's Europe Since 1989, A History, published in 2017. So for our conclusion, without minimizing the genuine positive achievements of 1989, if we're asking the question, did 1989 deliver on its promises? Did it justify the optimism of so many people observing those events? I think we've got to say no. And it was, in fact, a yes. See you later. And remember, check your evidence. Bye.